talk was scheduled last May. I had to cancel. My father-in-law died, and I'm dedicating the talk to him. He was a well-known naturalist in my region. He was also a well-known nature writer. So this goes to him, Juancho, va por ti. Okay. I'm going to be speaking about a long interest of mine, which is that of ape fiction. I'm dealing with ape fiction as a narrative of relationship. And what I'm going to be doing today is really present to you where I'm coming from conceptually, what kind of literature interests me, and the kind of conclusions that I'm reaching throughout this analysis. Let me begin by showing you a picture. This is La Casa Amarilla, the yellow house. It's in Tenerife, in Spain. And I learned about the existence of this place thanks to a novel, Coetzee, The Lives of Animals. I learned that in this same place, the first primate station in Europe was opened in 1912, and was actually open until 1920 thanks to funding by the Royal Prussian Academy of Science and by the action of a famous neuropsychologist, Max Rotham, who worked at the University of Berlin. Well, on page 125, Elizabeth Costellos, Coetzee's protagonist, deals with this place to prove science's nonsense when it comes to animal experimentation. In this novel, she comments on the possibility of the fact that Franz Kafka, who wrote the short story A Report to the Academy, possibly knew of the existence of the place and also knew of the existence of the mentality of apes, a work by Wolfgang Keller, who worked at the station for some time. So she ponders on this possibility, thinking that maybe, because both works were published in 1917, Kafka had heard of Keller's work. This connection gives Elizabeth Costello, who has been invited to the university where her son teaches, to give a talk on the poets and the animals, the opportunity also to talk about Sultan and compare Sultan, one of Keller's primate subjects at the station, with Kafka's Red Peter, the protagonist of A Report to the Academy. She actually comments that Sultan was the best of Keller's pupils, and in a certain sense, as she explains, the prototype of Red Peter, Kafka's protagonist. Here is Sultan, and you're also going to see a few more chimpanzees. This video was shot at the station, and it practically shows three of the main experiments conducted there by Keller. He was trying to prove whether or not chimpanzees were able to reason and to solve problems. He would normally use as motivation for the chimpanzees fruits such as bananas, and Costello in the novel describes these experiments as extremely cruel, because sometimes the chimpanzees would be starved in order for them to be more motivated to achieve the food. And this is a very famous one that she also describes in the novel, where the bananas were hanging above, and Keller wanted to see whether or not the chimpanzees would come up with a solution, and actually they did, by piling up the different crates and getting there. All right, so this passage of Costello's, of Coetzee's novel, is an example of what I will refer here as literary primatology, which I defined as the attempt at capturing our understanding of apes in literature. And as you will see, many of these are informed by actual science, so that there is a rich exchange between these two forms of knowledge. Ape imaginings are at the core of literary primatology, these being different from scientific accounts or descriptions of the animals. but also very useful. Because the truth is that, as many authors have already proved, we also need the products of our imagination to make sense of the world around us. I see the origin of literary primatology as old as our interest in apes. I know that primatology was born as a discipline in the 1960s, but interest in apes comes from way before, from the 17th century, the time when the first encounters between human and non-human apes started occurring more frequently. So one of the first points I would like to make is that besides our scientific knowledge of non-human primates, there is also room for knowing the animal through the stories we tell about them. And these stories may come from folklore, from legend, from myth, or from art. Actually, the painting, the portrait you saw at the very beginning is the product of a fellow researcher at one of my projects, Veronica Perales, who conducted research on gorillas, female gorillas in Spanish zoos, and came up with those beautiful paintings. So, by looking at the work of several authors that I will mention later, we can come up with a sort of genealogy of literary primatology. This kind of primatology is fundamentally based on two phenomena that started happening in the 17th century, which I see as the phenomena of naming the apes, and also the iconography, okay? So what I'm trying to say here is that we're going to see how from the 17th century onwards, there's a mixture between the knowledge we have through our imagination, through our musings about apes, and also through the first scientific understandings of apes. So with regard to names, in this study by Edward Tyson in 1698 of the first chimpanzee that was, of the chimpanzee that was dissected by this English anatomist, he decided to refer to the chimpanzee as pygmy. Pygmy was actually the name used by Pliny the Elder to refer to some of the monstrous races. This same phenomenon of recycling names taken from the products of our minds, our imagination, is also seen in the 20th century in names such as Troglodyta, gorilla for the gorilla. Troglodyte means cliff dweller, another of the monstrous races, or Pan Paniscus, Pan being the Greek god of the wild. In terms of the iconography, okay, we have the case of the Anthropomorpha by Linnaeus, where he describes 4 different types of hominid apes. And the interesting thing is to see how all the 4 are actually the product of recycled material. So, for example, in the case of the first one, of the Troglodyta boenti, you see that it comes from a previous illustration, Jacob de Bon's 1658 illustration of an orangutan. The Lucifer Androvaldi, the second one, it's actually inspired by the Breidebach's ape, which you see over there. They share the mane, they also share the stick motif. The third one, the Pygmeus eduardi, is actually a sort of translation of the very famous copper plate engraving of a tea-drinking chimpanzee. This female chimpanzee was actually in display in the 1738 in London, but it doesn't have the Pygmeus eduardi doesn't have. Sorry, the Satyrus tulpi doesn't have the cup. The fourth one, the Pygmeus eduardi, is actually inspired by Tyson's description of a chimpanzee. So you see this phenomenon of recycling images, recycling names. So this helps me to sort of illustrate the point I'm trying to make, that literary primatology is at the crossroads between science and literature, science and imagination. And the interest in the ape, of course, escalated after Darwin's presentations of his theories. And we see that in a lot of the scholarly work produced, for example, this book by Barbara Larsson and Faye Browers speak about the impact of Darwinism in visual culture. There is the very seminal Primate Visions by Donna Haraway. Also, John Sorenson and Raymond Corby, they have worked on cultural representations of apes in the West. In terms of the literature, which is actually my discipline, we have the work by Virginia Richter, by Miriam Copeland, and by Laura Brown about ape fiction. And more recently, we also have this work by Mary Sanders Pollock, who tries to apply literary analysis to field primatologist narratives. So I see this trend of an increase in the scholarly work on apes, apes and culture, apes and literature, as part of the phenomenon of the popularization of science that takes place in the 1950s, and that has been in the US, and that has been described by Greg Midman, which affected also primatology, and especially thanks to the Goodall effect, which was shared by Diane Fossey. And it has also, of course, affected the literature. In the 20th century and the 21st century, lots of authors, especially English-speaking authors, as Marion Copeland has shown in her ape bibliography, have decided to incorporate the ape in their writing. And actually, I have come up with a list of 17 novels written in English, most of them in the United States, 14 of them, two of them in Great Britain and one in Canada, that in the 21st century deal with apes. I'm not interested in all of them because I'm focusing mainly, but I'm showing you my sort of tables, I'm focusing mainly on those that I consider to be examples of a speculative fiction that sort of problematizes our relationship with these species, okay, these boundary species. And I have come up with, in my analysis, with a kind of subdivision into themes, three main themes. The first one is animal experimentation, which is divided also in 4 different sub-themes. The first sub-theme has to do with raising a baby chimpanzee alongside a human baby, and you have good examples of this in the science produced throughout the 20th century, examples such as the one that I'm showing there, that's Gua, that was brought up by the Kellogg's in the 1930s in the United States. She's hugging her human brother, and Karen Joy Fowler has produced a very much acclaimed novel, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, where she deals about the effects this sort of experiment have both for the chimpanzee and for the human. Another sub-theme is that of ape language experiments. In here, what you see is that apes normally in fiction, either they are going to use sign language or even verbal language, as it happens in Benjamin Hale's The Evolution of Bruno Littlemore, or even they are telepaths, they speak telepathic language, okay? And there you see a famous case of the gorilla Coco, trained in sign language by Francine Peterson. Another sub-theme is animal testing in laboratories. Normally they have bioengineered bodies at their center, or cases of xenotransplantation. I'm borrowing that image from an article published by a group of scientists at the LMU. They are being very successful in producing bioengineered hearts from pigs that they are placing on baboons. And a good case in point to illustrate this sub-theme is Brenda Peterson's Animal Heart. Last but not least of these sub-themes is ape-human miscegenation. maybe inspired by the experiments conducted by the Russian scientist Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, who tried to inseminate 3 female chimpanzees with human sperm. And inspired in these sort of experimentations, we can find Loris Gonzalez's Lucy and Kelpie Wilson's Primate Tears. Another main category is that of animal activism, which normally have animal rescue at their center, such as is the case with Sarah Gruen's Ape House. And a final one is field primatology. Novels like William Boyd's Brazzaville Beach normally are going to have female primatologists as protagonists. Okay? Well, these categories oftentimes overlap, but I have come up, and I have time for that, with a series of conclusions that are sort of, or characteristics that are common to them. The first one is that they are normally animal biographies or animalographies, a term that has been coined by Huff and Hafner. So they tell the story of the animal either from the perspective of the human or the perspective of the animal. They can also be inscribed within the genre of the animal teacher or the moral animal. So they are highly didactic. Normally the human, affected by the relationship with the animal, learns how to be more empathic to the more than human world, or even learns to accept his or her animality. They also deal constantly with the contingent nature of the species boundary, so that we find oftentimes processes of humanization or animalization in reverse. And this makes these narratives of relationship also narratives of transformation. The role of affect, of emotion and intimacy is of great importance as well, and this also deals with the fact that the narratives end up also becoming narratives of atonement, where the human, transformed by the relationship with the animal, sort of ends up having the feeling that he needs to make amends with the more than human world for the abuses committed against it. So this is actually specifically expressed on the fate of the animal. The animal normally is either turned into a captive, he dies or she dies, or is on the run. So all this leads me to conclude by arguing that these narratives are part of the discourse derived from today's Anthropocene anxiety, from which a feeling of grief for our changing environment, or solastalgia, using Albrecht's term, and a growing recognition of species interdependency make us increasingly aware of the role we are to play in sort of sorting out this problem and stopping the destruction of the planet. In fact, in Deniek Quinn's novel Ishmael, its protagonist, a telepathic gorilla by the same name, concludes the story with a warning for humanity expressed in the following koan, with which I would like to finish my talk today. With man gone, will there be hope for gorilla? With gorilla gone, will there be hope for man? Thank you.